We're on the Mishnah on Yud Beis and Beis 12b, first Mishnah. A little more than halfway down the page. Okay, so this last week, I think it was Thursday. I'm sorry, it was Friday. Okay, so Friday we spoke about a guy. We spoke about this also on Wednesday when it came up. The guy makes a neder to become a Nazir and to shave a Nazir. Shaving a Nazir means you shave his head and you bring his karbonos. You conclude his Naziris. So he did two. In the previous mission, the guy did two things. Number one, he became a Nazir. Number two, he's going to shave somebody else's Naziris. In our Mishnah, it's different. The guy says, I'm committing to bring half of another Nazir's karbonos. Like I said, a Nazir brings 3 karbonos, chatos, an oila, and a shlomim. He says he's going to bring half a Nazir's karbonos. His friend heard, and I will also commit to bringing half of a Nazir's karbonos. The halacha is zeh megalech nazir shalom v'zeh megalech nazir shalom. Each of them need to shave a full nazir. Meaning, even if these two people meet up with each other and they find a suitable nazir to take care of, they can't split the costs. Each one of them has to find a full nazir and pay for all the expenses. I'm explaining to Gemara why this is. Divrei Meir, this is the opinion of Meir. And the rabbis say, each of them pay for half, and if they both found one Nazir, they can split his expenses 50-50. Okay, so the Gemara will address this and point out there's a lot of semantics going on here. It really depends on how he said it, and that's really the debate. Everyone agrees if the guy says half of the sacrifices of a Nazir, chatzi korban maisi, he brings half of the sacrifices. In that case, there's no question about what he means. He means half of the sacrifices of a Nazir. That's what he said. Let's say he says, 1 second, hold on. Let's say it says karbonos chatzi nazir alai. Kula korban boy isuya. Then he has to bring everything. 1 second. Okay. If he says karbonos chatzi nazir alai, so he's saying the sacrifices of half a nazir. In other words, in the first case, the word chatzi, half, was used on the word of karbonos, sacrifices. In the second scenario, it's karbonos chatzi nazir. It's the sacrifices of a half a nazir. Now, as you remember, there's no such thing as a half a nazir. So in that case, kula korban boy isuya. You have to bring a full set of sacrifices, because it's not clear where the Gemara Yud Beis and Beis, first word in the line is isuya. And we're on.
More you say?
Yeah, it's about 10 lines off the bottom of the page.
Oh, because Omer Rabba.
Yeah,
12B
2 lines.
12B, right?
12b, yeah, 2 lines further down.
It begins with
Isuye.
okay.
The next word is my time. My timer. Okay. My timer. Delay Eshkan Naziris the Palga, because there's no such thing as a half and a Naziris. Okay. So what's the debate between the Rameir and the rabbis? Which terminology was used in the Mishnah? In other words, he's saying there really isn't that much of a debate. Rameir Samar Kivin Amar Hare Alai Ichayev Akulei. Rameir says, since he says I'm accepting half a Nazir, the word I'm accepting implies you're accepting the whole thing. And then you try to say it's a chatzi Nazir, half a Nazir. This thing is a half a Nazir. Whereas there's no such thing as a half Naziris, and you can't change it. It's considered a neder with an immediate clarification. that the neder only applies to half of the karbonis of the nazir, and therefore you only bring half. So it's more of a semantic debate than a practical halachic debate.
How do you bring half of three?
So you bring cash, you pay,
Oh, okay.
Okay. It says in the next Mishnah, Harain. Okay, it's an interesting one. So like we said, most of Naziris seems to have occurred where people are sort of in a desperate situation. You have somebody who's hanging over a cliff and needs to be rescued, and he promises God he'll become a Nazir. And then a helicopter comes and rescues him, and he's like, "Okay, God, forget about the Naziris." Another type of Naziris that seemed to have happened quite frequently was somebody who was giving Naziris as today somebody wants to thank Hashem, wants to let everybody know he experienced some sort of miraculous event, or he feels some great thing Hashem did for him. Wants to thank him, so he gives a kiddush in shul, or he donates money. In times of the temple, they accept a Naziris. So what does this guy do? He says, "Hareini Nazir l'kishayili ben." I'm going to be a Nazir when I have a child. V'noyad leben, and he gave birth to a son. Okay, we'll soon see here that the word ben, so ben means a son. It could also mean a child. In this case, it means specifically a son, a male child, a male infant. Harez a Nazir. So in that case, that's fine. That makes him a Nazir again. So the guy says, "I'm a Nazir when I have a child." When he has a child, he becomes a Nazir. Let's say he had a daughter, or he had tumtum androgynous. It's somebody whose sexual identity was unclear, right? An androgynous has both genitalia of male and female, and a tumtum is it's where it's been covered over by a layer of skin. So tumtum, you don't know what it is. Ain't a Nazir. That person is not a Nazir. Okay, why is he not a Nazir in this scenario of a tumtum and androgynous? Because, one second. Yeah, okay, we'll see about this in the Gemara. In other words, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah that a person does not accept a suffix Naziris. There's no such thing as a question of doubt in Naziris. Naziris needs to be certain. If it's not certain, he would never have wanted to accept it. Similarly, if he says, when I have a fetus, so in other words, when he says Vlad, he's going to have a child, even if the child was someone whose sexual identity was unclear, or somebody who had a daughter, that's included, and they're also called an infant, and he has to accept the Naziris. Let's say Hipila Ishlei, his wife had a miscarriage. Ain't a Nazir, he's not a Nazir. Okay, what exactly does this mean? Hipila Ishlei, his wife had a miscarriage. So now, within the context of a miscarriage, I guess the Gemara is presuming there's two ways a miscarriage could have happened. Number one is that the fetal development was never viable in the first place. It's very, very common. My mother had quite a few of those. There was never any, you become pregnant, there was never a chance that the fetus would come to term, because the development wasn't proceeding according to plan, and the fetus was sort of dead before it was alive. There was no chance it was going to be born alive. And then you have situations of miscarriage where you have a full-grown healthy child, and it's a miscarriage, stillborn, unfortunate situation. This is what's called, is it a ben kayama or is it not a ben kayama? A ben kayama means a child that would have delivered at term, except for an event that occurred and resulted in miscarriage, or a child whose pregnancy was never viable in the first place. So again, if the child was a viable pregnancy, but miscarried early, was born still, without a heartbeat, so then the Naziris is valid. That's called a viable fetus. On the other hand, if the child if the fetus was never viable in the first place, it would never have come to term. So then that's not called a ben kayama, and that is not included in his Naziris. Now that the mother miscarried, we don't know whether the child was viable or not viable. Okay, now according to Rabbi Yehudah, remember, anytime we have a question of doubt, what's Rabbi Yehudah's opinion? Let's just jog our memories. We saw this on Thursday and Wednesday, I think, and a week ago also. So it's Wednesday. What?
Question of doubt.
Any question of doubt? What's the classical example for Rabbi Yehudah? The guy says, if there's 100 pounds in this bucket, then I'm a Nazir. And before they have a chance to weigh the bucket, somebody spills it out or it's stolen. So you don't know whether there would have been 100 pounds in the bucket or not. According to Rabbi Yehudah, you are not a Nazir, because Rabbi Yehudah presumes that if you are a Nazir of doubt, you're really in an impossible situation. The only way out of there is, we'll see Rabbi Shimon's solution. You have to do this convoluted thing, maybe accept even multiple Nazirs. Rabbi Yehudah says the person would rather not be either be in a certain Nazir or not a Nazir at all. Nobody wants to be in a situation where there's a suffix whether or not he's a Nazir. Okay. So this is, and our mission is the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. However, Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon says if it's stolen, if the guy has the 100 pounds in the bucket's stolen before they had a chance to weigh it, the guy is a Nazir. He's a Nazir misafik, a doubtful Nazir. So Rabbi Shimon says this is what you have to do. In other words, if this woman has a miscarriage, her husband has to make the following statement. Yomir says as follows: Im hayed ben kayama, if the child was a viable fetus, harani Nazir chayva. So then I've obligated myself in a Nazir previously. The guy said before his wife delivered, or whatever, while his wife is expecting, when I have a child, I should be a Nazir. Then the child miscarries. He says as follows: if the child was a ben kayama, the child was viable, so then I am a Nazir because of what happened back then. V'imlav, if he wasn't a viable Nazir, then right now I'm a Nazir. I'm just decided to become a Nazir. So now, if the child was viable, so then he's a Nazir because he's obligated to. If his child wasn't viable, he's still a Nazir because he accepted a new Naziris. Okay, and then he brings a set of sacrifices at the end of 30 days, and when he finishes Naziris, because either way, he's finished his Naziris, and of course he has all the restrictions of Nazir until he makes the statement. It's only once he makes a statement, he counts 30 days, and then he loses the restrictions of Nazir. One second. Okay, so now what happens? Chazer v'yolda. So there was apparently she was carrying twins. This is before the days of sonograms and ultrasounds. They didn't know. You didn't necessarily know if you were carrying twins.
Please get Rabbi.
You were in 13a, and we're the end of the third line.
Thank you.
So chazer v'yolda harei a Nazir. So then, according to Rabbi Yehudah, you're certainly a Nazir. You committed the miscarriage is 0, and then your wife had a child. That child commits it to Naziris, like you promised. That makes sense. Shimon Aimer as follows. Shimon says the first one's a suffix, and now the question is what to do with the second one. Shimon Aimer, Yomer should say as follows: Ima Rishon ben Kayama. If the first child was viable, so then Harishan Chayav Azunadava. Then the first child is obligating myself to become an Nazir, and for this child, I'm giving a gift of Naziris. Imlav Harishan Adava V'Zuchayva. And if the first child was not viable, and the first child, I'm going to do an extra Naziris for the first child, even though it wasn't viable, and the second child is what I accepted. So now the guy has to keep 2 Naziris. We'll soon see. It's interesting when you have 2. Let's say a person has to keep 2 Naziris. Oftentimes he's allowed to count them consecutively, and then bring all the karbonis at the end. So you do 30 days for one, 30 days for the next, and then bring 2 sets of karbonis. Okay. So the Gemara says, okay, we're at the Gemara. You give a little bit aleph. Haimai, what exactly is the chiddush of our Mishnah? Haimai lememor, what exactly is the chiddush? If the guy says a son, presumably means a son. So the Gemara says Mishum Seifa, because of the end. Bas Tumtum Androgenes Ein a Nazir. If the guy says he's going to have a son, and he has a daughter or someone with a questionable, sexual identity, so then Ein a Nazir, he's not a Nazir. Pshita, that seems to be obvious. He said a son. I would think that the word ben doesn't actually mean a son; it means child. It means when I will have children. The word ibona is an interesting terminology. This is what I believe. This is what Rachel told Yaakov when she gave her Zilpah, when she gave him Zilpah. So Rachel didn't have any children, and she gave Yaakov one of her maidservant to have a relationship with, so that she should have children from at least from her maidservant. And the word terminology there is l'kashi ibona, to have children, so that I be built. Okay, so Kamash Mondalai, the chiddush of our mission is that ben means a son and not a child. He says that I have a child, pshita, it seems to be obvious. Maybe it means, it's interesting. In some circles, when you'll hear somebody say that he has a child, they have a child, you probably know it's a girl. If they had a son, they'd say I had a son. No, I'm not saying that there's any preference one over another, but the Gemara seems to quite clearly to actually indicate that a person should want to have sons, although obviously 50% or roughly around that number is going to be daughters.
We say after the Torahs come out in parentheses.
But so I would think maybe that he wants specifically to have sons. Child also means son, and certainly it doesn't mean a tuntum and androgynous. Those are very difficult to have. So Kamash Malon, that no, a child means a child and includes everybody. Hepila ishtai ein a nazir. If his wife had a miscarriage, we're not sure whether the fetus was viable or not. Ein a nazir is not a nazir. Man katani la. Who says this? Gemara says Rabbi Yehudah decreehu. It's Rabbi Yehudah of the pile. This, remember, is the pile. The question is how much is in the pile. Before they had a chance to measure it, the pile was stolen or it was knocked over and moved out. Okay. Now we get to Rav Shimon Omer. 1 second. Okay, Rav Shimon says, Yemer should say ben kayama hareini nazir chayva v'mlav hareini nazir nedavar. Okay. Now let's just go a little bit brief background here. There are a number of different types of twins in the world. I would say the most common two types that people talk about is as follows. There's identical twins is when a fertilized egg splits and the two children are identical. Obviously, they're the same gender, same genetic makeup. Identical twins could sometimes be born in two separate sacs, usually one sac, but that's really a separate discussion. And then there are twins that come from a double ovulation. And, most twins were incredibly rare until the medication Clomid came out, and then everybody started having twins because Clomid, one of the side effects of Clomid is that it causes double ovulation. And, non-identical twins are often what they call Clomid twins. So in a double ovulation, there is a very rare percentage of women that will naturally ovulate two eggs at once. And doesn't necessarily happen at once. It could happen within the same cycle. Doesn't necessarily happen at the same instant. So what is possible is that if a woman gives birth to twins, those twins were conceived at different times, a day or 2 days apart. Okay, that will be the Gemara's discussion. So those again, there's going to be identical twins and non-identical twins. So identical twins come from a single conception that splits, and non-identical twins could possibly come from two different conceptions. They could have been conceived at different times. Okay. Now I'm not a medical expert, and it could be someone will correct me and say that you can have non-identical twins from a single conception. I don't know the specifics, but that's roughly speaking, that's what the Gemara is.
You have certain misconceptions about the subject.
It's quite possible. So okay. Anyway, okay. Ba'amine Rab Abba me Rav Huna. Rab Abba had the following question from Rav Huna. Hareini Nazir l'kashayili ben. The guy says, I'm a Nazir when I have a son. V'hipila ishtai. His wife miscarried. Okay, so immediately, 1 second. Okay. Now, this guy, again, so the guy, obviously nobody knows that they're expecting twins, at least for a certainty, because we're before the days of ultrasounds. Okay, the Hipila Ishtai, and his wife has a miscarriage. Okay, now at that moment, according to Rabbi Yehudah, he's exempt from Nazirus, right? Because we don't know if the first birth, the stillborn, was a viable pregnancy or was not a viable pregnancy. Again, this is the days before. Today we can detect the fetal heartbeat from, I don't know, very, very early, a couple of weeks old, and we can identify if a fetus is going to be stillborn well before it actually is one. And therefore, today, if a woman miscarries, they'll often deliver the baby, at a relatively young, preterm, whereas in Talmudic times it would take significantly longer for that baby to be delivered. Okay, so his wife miscarries the first child. For some reason, he decides to separate a korban for his Nazirus. And then what happens? V'chazra v'yalda, she has a second child. Mahu. So now the question is as follows. 1 second. Okay, so now the question is as follows. Do we say that these are a single conception, and therefore we presume that both pregnancies were viable? Or do we say, no, not necessarily. Maybe they were conceived at two separate times, a day or two apart, whatever it was, for however long it takes for a double ovulation. And therefore, even though one was viable, it could be the second one was not viable. Now, I'm sure modern science would offer us some other possibilities, but I guess this is what the Talmudic expectations of its day were. Okay. So now let's examine the question. Now, aliba de man. Who's the question for? Aliba de Reb Shimon, ma'iti boyle. According to Reb Shimon, this isn't really much of a question. Ha'amar Reb Shimon, safik Nazirus lahachmer. Shimon says if you're in doubt about Nazirus, you'll accept a double Nazirus. You can be machmer, you'll accept as much Nazirus as you need to. Okay, so according to Reb Shimon, obviously there's two Nazirus here. Just like if you miscarried without a second child, you'll accept the Nazirus. The aliba de Rabbi Yehudah to Amar Safik Nazirus lahakal. According to Rabbi Yehudah, that says there's no such thing as a Safik Nazir. You either are a Nazir or you aren't a Nazir, and nobody would ever accept a Nazirus that results in a Safik, because the consequences are beyond a certain Nazirus. A certain Nazirus has a fixed start, a fixed end date. You know what to do when it comes the end date. A Nazir of Safik is stuck. He can never end his Nazirus because he can't bring any sacrifices, because those sacrifices could be chulin ba'azara. They could be, if it turns out he isn't a Nazir, then those sacrifices aren't real, in which case he is not allowed to bring them into the temple, and he does not have a defined end date. So my Kaddish Eloi Kaddish. Do we say that his sacrifices are sanctified or not? Here's the question. If the children were conceived separately, so it's very likely that the first child that miscarried was not a viable child, and therefore the acceptance of he is not a Nazir, period. He's not a Nazir, because if it had its own conception and it's a doubt, maybe it was viable, maybe it wasn't viable, and therefore according to Rabbi Yehudah, you're not a Nazir. However, the other side of the equation is, look, hold on a second. She has twins. Why don't we say that one of the twins proves that the other twin was viable, and therefore you should be a double Nazir. You should be Nazir twice, once for each twin, and the sacrifices that you separated immediately should be the sacrifices that were separated immediately should be valid sacrifices. They were separated on a valid basis. So the Gemara says, "My kaddish or loy kaddish? Are they sanctified or not? What's the difference whether or not they're sanctified?" Okay, so once you separate a sacrifice, obviously you cannot. You can't use it. You can't use it. It's prohibited for avodah, for work in the field. So if it's an ox, you can't use it to plow. And if it's a sheep, you cannot shear it. it's not shared until you bring it to the temple and you slaughter it. So the question is, let's say somebody went ahead and worked with the animal. Do they have to bring? Do they get malchus? Do they get lashes or not? Is this animal forbidden or not? So the Mar says, "Teku, let it stand," and it is an unresolved question. Okay, next question. Boy mine ben rechume me abaya. Okay, I'll. These are complicated. I learned this Gemara a little bit late last night, so I tried. I think I have it, but it is too complicated. Okay, let's go outside first, and then I'll explain to you what the variables will be. So the following. This is the question. Our Mishnah. What happened? One guy says, "I'm going to shave half an nazir," and the other guy says, "I'm going to do this." I'm sorry. Our Mishnah is where a guy says, "I'm going to have a nazir," and when I have a child. Okay. So let's make a few different variables. Okay, I'm going to become a nazir when I have a child. I'm going to become a nazir when you have a child, and I'm going to become a nazir when Yankel has a child, some third party who isn't present. So in any one of these three scenarios, the guy says, "I'm a nazir." Let's say somebody repeats after him exactly what he says. So I'm a nazir. The first guy says, Reuben says, "I'm a nazir when I have a child." And Shimon says, "Oh, I like that. I'm going to do the same thing." What are you going to do the same thing to? What exactly are you doing? When you Shimon have a child, or when I have a child? Let's say Reuben's talking to Shimon, and Reuben says to Shimon, "I'm going to become a nazir when you have a child. You Shimon have a child." And Shimon says, "Oh, I like that. I'm going to do the same thing." You're going to do the same thing that when Reuben has a child, or when you have a child, you're also going to become a nazir. You get together? And the third scenario, we'll see, maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe it's the fourth one here. But and the fourth scenario is roughly something like Reuben says, "I'm going to become a nazir when Yankel has a child." And Shimon says, "You know what? I like that too." Well, what do you like? You like Yankel or you like yourself? Who do you like? Do you like Yankel that you're going to become a nazir when Yankel has a child too? Or you like yourself that when you have a child, you're going to become a nazir? Okay. This is roughly speaking the different variables in the question. Boy mine ben Rechume me Abaya. The son of Rechume had a question from Abaya. Hareini nazir l'kashiyeheli ben. Reuven says, "I'm going to become a nazir when Reuven have a child." And Shimon heard it. Va'amar says, "Va'alai. I'm going to do the same thing." Well, what does he mean here? Hold on a minute. Or 1 second. 1 second. Or there's a lot of variations here in the text. Okay. Shimon went ahead and said, "Va'ani, I'm going to do the same thing. Me and I." And so Reuven says, "I'm a nazir when I have a child." Shimon says, "I'm going to do the same thing." Mahu, what's the story? Adibure mashma. Did he mean to say what the guy's words were? In other words, did he mean to say that when Reuven has a child, Shimon says, when Reuven has a child, I'm going to become a nazir? Agufe mashma. Or did he mean to say it on himself? Make sure I have this right here. 1 second. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So in other words, if it's adibure, if we say it's an echo of what he said, that means that Shimon becomes a nazir when Reuven has a child. If it's agufe, he means to say the exact same statement, but in reference to himself and not to his friend. Okay, intim salam agufe. Let's see, he'll say that in this scenario, Shimon means to say it on himself. In other words, Shimon accepts a nazir. Shimon accepts to be a nazir if he has a child. Amaris, if he says Hareini nazir, 1 second, just make sure I have this right here. Let's say Reuven says, I'm a child when you Shimon have a child. I'm a Nazir when you Shimon have a child. And his friend says, and me too. In other words, Shimon says, I'm also Mahu. And Avsheka Amar. Is he saying that I will become a Nazir when I have a child? Just like you're becoming a Nazir when I have a child, I'm going to become a Nazir when I have a child. Or perhaps, I like you just like you like me. It's just like you're going to become a Nazir when I have a child, I'm going to become a Nazir when you have a child. Okay, 1 second. Okay, now, Imtim Tzalaymar call Ba'anpe, Sifa Milsam. Let's say you'll say that let's say Reuven and Shimon are standing together, and Reuven says, I'm a Nazir when you Shimon have a child. And Shimon says, me too. So it could be that it's sort of embarrassing to, you want to echo your friendship. So presumably the appropriate response to be is, I'm going to become a Nazir when you Reuven have a child. That's what he means to say. So what happens if he says as follows? Amar Hareini Nazir leploini ben, when our distant friend Yankel has a child. And his friend says, me too. Mi amrina and shaloi b'fanav anaf shekamar. Do we say since Yankel is not present in the conversation, he means to say, just like you're becoming a Nazir when Yankel has a child, I'm going to become a Nazir when I have a child? Or does he mean to say, no, I like Yankel just like you like Yankel, and when Yankel has a child, we're both going to become Nazir. I'm going to become a Nazir like you. I like Yankel like you like Yankel. So the Gemara says, Tiboy, it's an open question. Just shouldn't miss anything here.
A lot that goes around. Open questions.
Yeah. So Gemara's open questions, right?
So when you have open questions, what, sometime or other, I guess, they're resolved.
So I would say no. I would say these questions, if somebody accepts such a Nazir, the question is whether we can invoke Rabbi Yehudah. Maybe we'll say you invoke Rabbi Yehudah and you're not a Nazir at all. That'd be an interesting question. Alternatively, you become a Suffolk Nazir. That's what would happen. Okay. What time is it? 48. Okay, let's start the Mishnah, and maybe see another question. Okay. Hareini Nazir v'Nazir Hishayili ben. I'm a Nazir, and I'm also a Nazir when I have a child. Okay. So Hischal Moines Shalai. He starts counting his own Naziris. Okay, so let's presume his wife was close to term, and he says, I'm a Nazir, and I'm a Nazir when I have a child. So he starts counting. He counts, let's say, 15 days, and then his wife has a baby. So now he's a Nazir because he had a child. So what does he do? Mashlam es Shalai. So he finishes another 15 days until his Naziris is concluded. That's the 30-day Naziris. And then immediately he starts counting for his son, another 30 days. Why is that? Because he accepted his Naziris first, right? First he said, I'm a Nazir. Then he said, I'm a Nazir when I have a child. So your Naziris gets prioritized over the Naziris that you promised when you would have a child. Okay. Next case. Let's say he says, Hareini Nazir k'sheyili ben. I'm a Nazir when I have a child. And v'Nazir, and I'm also a Nazir. So now we give precedence to the Naziris following the birth of a child. And his Chalmoines Shalai, we start counting his own Naziris first. I'm sorry, he starts counting his own Naziris immediately. So let's say he counts same story, he counts 15 days, his wife has a baby. And then he has a child. Miniach es Shalai. He pauses his own Naziris. Then he counts 30 days for his son. And then he finishes his own Naziris. Okay, let's just go through a few points here. Okay, as follows. we learned that the minimum Naziris is 30 days. There's no such thing as a Naziris less than 30 days. There's another interesting law, which is that when you shave your hair at the end of Naziris, you need to have at least 30 days worth of growth. Now, let's say in this last scenario, the guy counts 15 days of Naziris for himself. Then he counts 30 days for his son. If he shaves his head then he will not be able to shave his head in the next 15 days because he has to wait at least 30 days before he cuts his hair. So now we say that what he actually does is he counts another 15 days and then he shaves his head and brings 2 sets of karbonis. So he ends both Naziris 15 days after he ended the second Naziris, and 45 days after 60 days after he began the first. Right, so 15, 30, 15. And then he shaves his head and brings 2 sets of karbonis to end both Naziris, because the minimum quantity for cutting your hair is 30 days. It's got to be at least 30 days worth of growth. 51. Okay, let's begin the next Gemara. We'll review it again tomorrow. Boy Rova, the following question. Omar, if he says Hareini Nazir la'achar esrim yom. He says, I'm a Nazir, I want to accept Naziris after 20 days. Ume achshav, and this is a Stam Naziris. Stam Naziris is 30 days. However, Ume achshav, I want now to begin 100 yom, 100 days. Okay, so what does that mean? 1 second. So he's saying I'm starting in Naziris right now of 100 days, and then I want to, and then after 20 days I want to do a Stam Naziris. Mahu, what's the story? Kiven the Halein Mea be'esrim loy shalman loy chaylan. Do we say that because we know that in 20 days he's going to start Naziris and he will not finish his Naziris right now? Do we say that he actually means a 20-day waiting period, and then he counts the Stam Naziris of 30 days? Presumably he ends it by shaving his head and bringing the karbonis, and then he starts 100-day Naziris. Idilmo, no, even the Isla Gidol Sarah B'Saif, Chayolan, or do we say, look, at the end of the day, he has 20 days of Naziris, 80 days left for the 100-day Naziris. Then he does 30 days of his second Naziris, the after 20-day Naziris. It's 50 days. Then he shaves his head, and then he has another 80 days of Naziris left, so he could shave his head again at the conclusion of the 80 days of Naziris.
It says after 20 days, he didn't start his Naziris till 20 days.
So he makes 2 Naziris here.
Yeah.
First Naziris, he says, after 20 days, I'm becoming a Nazir.
Okay.
So that's the 30-day Naziris. It's going to be from day 20 to day 50. He also says, right now, I'm beginning 100-day Naziris.
Oh, okay.
And so he's making 2 different Naziris.
Kind of in parallel.
Yeah, but now the question is, does 100-day Naziris start immediately? Do we say, look, count 20 days, then do 30 days, then end it, and then count the remaining 80 days, and you'll shave your head at the end of it, because 80 days is enough time to be able to have tagalachas. Okay. Or do we say no? Or do we say that he meant to do was to keep the first 20 days of merry wine drinking and tuma, and afterwards he'll start after 20 days, and the me'achshav, the now, means after it all ends. Okay. We'll continue tomorrow. Okay. Enjoy your morning.